Hey, everybody. Ooh, that is loud. I'm Stewart Scott. I work with the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and we work at the kind of intersection of cybersecurity and technology policy, get to do a lot of cool cross-collaboration. In the past couple of years, we've had the privilege to be working on a lot of software supply chain security topics. And so we started trying to think in kind of a risk management framework, looking for sources of risk and sources of security. And one that's caught our attention recently has been kind of the ecosystem of vulnerability research, contributing kind of disclosures to companies and libraries and all of those code bases from outside of the projects. I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with kind of the growing market share bug bounty platforms, kind of representing the growing acceptance and kind of investment in those programs and frameworks. And it's a pretty direct manifestation of the many eyes theory of security, right? More people looking at code, better chance of finding issues with it, and they get paid in the process. And we've also seen more kind of government initiatives working to open up their kind of intakes for the same kind of information. And all of that is governed by what's generally called the Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure process. It's unique to different organizations, and we'll just go with CVD for now. But what really got us interested was some data that came out of congressional testimony in February in the wake of the Log4j hearings in Congress. There were some anonymized breakdowns of where funds went from bug bounty platforms. And what we were starting to think about was where did those kind of reserves of expertise and research localize, and where are their kind of bottlenecks? And the big question we arrived at was, can bad policy or a lack of good policy end up breaking that ecosystem, interrupting vulnerability contributions, and significantly degrade security as a result? And can we detect that happening in publicly available data, ideally? And the kind of perfect case study we found for this was looking at the process of disclosure behind Log4j. So I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with Carnegie Mellon. They have a pretty comprehensive guide to CVD. And this is a little excerpt of how they describe it as pathfinding between telling everybody immediately when you find a vulnerability and never telling anyone anything at any point. And trying to find that optimal path is very context dependent. But this was a great example of a researcher at Alibaba Cloud figured out the vulnerability and reported it directly and privately to Apache pretty promptly, and they began patching. And pretty soon after, he followed up, communicating that either on the 8th or 9th of December, he'd started noticing that the vulnerability was making its way into more public fora, which in turn spurred on their patching process. And this is a pretty good breakdown of how the kind of withholding of information should work, right? If you find the vulnerability, you don't want to tell everybody, just those who can best fix it, until it becomes more public, and then the utility of holding on to it decreases, and you need to get people in the position to at least patch or mitigate as best as they can and as quickly as they can. But what really caught our attention was soon after all of that started playing out, there was some reporting that Alibaba had been sanctioned for how it handled the vulnerability by China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. They were suspended for about 6 months, I believe, from an information sharing forum with the government. And it's not quite clear from reporting publicly available what the actual mechanism was to pull them off of that forum. It was either in the contract to be there, they had to share information and failed to do so promptly, or a law passed in July 2021 and taking effect in September 2021, requiring that network providers in China, when they find a vulnerability, among other things, have to tell the MIIT within a couple of days. So we've seen reporting claiming both of those were the kind of legal mechanisms involved, but the actual specifics aside, the letter of the law, the regulations on the management of security vulnerabilities, and that's a translation, so there are a bunch of different phrasings, was kind of clearly violated, right? Alibaba, the network product provider, had the vulnerability and didn't tell the MIIT within 2 days. And that's, from the general perspective of CVD, how you should proceed with that kind of information, right? Only tell those who need to know until the information is more publicly available, and then tell those who need to mitigate. So the majority of the reporting on the RMSV is very focused on what happens to vulnerabilities passed to government early. But our focus is on using it as a really convenient case study to look at this supply side question, right? Can something come up in either a legal context or otherwise that will disrupt that flow of vulnerabilities to those who can patch? It's very convenient because, as the second slide showed, China is a huge producer of this kind of research and work. It also provides a really clear timeline for us. There are only a few key dates we have to check to see if anything happened. And it provides a nice kind of control group, right? The law only applies to entities in China, although there's some blurriness around that. But it gives us a view into what happens in one location and what doesn't happen in others. And the pathway for a chilling mechanism on that research is pretty clear. Either companies receiving information have to rework their internal processes, or the researchers and research entities have to kind of negotiate what the risk is of following proper CVD, what the risk is of following the law, or at least wait until there's some more legal clarity. And to be clear, this isn't focused purely on China. We've seen the same kind of dynamics at play all over the world. So for example, in Germany, a researcher found a vulnerability within an election polling app, reported it, and was threatened with legal action. Similarly, in Missouri, a researcher found in the HTML, I think it was of the State Department of Education's website, that they could pull social security numbers from employees, and they didn't do that, but they were also kind of threatened for basically reading the web page. And there have been some good developments as well, with the DOJ declining to prosecute good faith research, whatever they kind of consider that to be. ANISA in Europe is pushing member states to develop, as governments, their own CVD processes. And CISA itself has also put out a binding directive, and I think the deadline for compliance has expired at this point, but for government agencies to set up their own processes. But that brings us back to what the question we wanted to take a look at some data and try to answer is, which is, did the RMSV create some kind of supply shock by disincentivizing participation in that pipeline of vulnerabilities and vulnerability research? And if so, what did it look like? Can we detect it? Are there other weird things going on in the data that we should take a look at? And does that supply shock, if it exists, trickle into the overall ecosystem, or is there some resilience built into the system? And along the way, too, we get to see a pretty cool insight into how those vulnerabilities are reported by companies and how that record making and record keeping is done. So to answer this question, we started looking at acknowledgement data in CVE logs and security updates from companies, and we focused in on Microsoft, Apple, F5, VMware, and Red Hat. We wanted to get a nice breadth of proprietary products and open source ones, and to kind of really span between consumer-facing products, very kind of in the stack and on the racks software suites, and everything in between. And there's lots of differences in how those companies manage that information internally, so getting that kind of diversity in there is very useful for us. And to set up that kind of nominal timeline of events to check against, we started with July 2020, which is the earliest kind of public discussion acknowledging that reporting requirement in the RMSV. July 2021, when the law was passed, September 2021, when the law takes effect, and then possibly, if we can get recent enough data, December 2021, where there's a maybe incident of enforcement, which again, we don't really know what happened, but the letter of the law seems to have been broken. Of course, those events don't exist in a vacuum, right? So summers of 2020 and 2021 were also full of sanctions from US government against Chinese companies that may have done something to that kind of pipeline. And there's also a lot of cybersecurity regulation going on in China at the same time. So even if we find something and it lines up nicely, it's really hard to tell what causal mechanisms there are without talking to actual people on the ground. But this is our basic process. We either downloaded things directly where they were made available or used some simple scraping scripts to pull those data sets out. And then the key things we were looking at were CVEs, the public acknowledgement date, and the publicly credited entity. And from there, we just tagged the entities to the country as a proxy for their kind of operating legal environment. There was a lot of information, too, about individual researchers, but we didn't apply that same analysis to that part of the data, in part because it's a lot harder to get location data, and in part because the law doesn't clearly apply itself to individual researchers so much as large companies. But then we just batched them by month and ran some simple tests to see if anything happened on those key dates. And these are just the inputted countries to that process. The data set, I cannot tell you how messy it was, but it was very bad. Lots of these things are hand-entered. There's lots of typos, lots of irregularities. There's really interesting things going on with the dates. So sometimes security updates will include a CVE that is publicly acknowledged afterwards, but somehow retroactively added. But sometimes they won't. So there's lots of fuzziness there, and there's not any clarity really on the actual process where you have a private reporting date, public acknowledgement date, and whatever kind of backtrack data filling is going on. It's also hard to compare between these 5 different ecosystems we've set up. partly because of how they organize the data. So some are organized by pure CVE number, some are organized by affected product, some are organized by security updates, and that leads to a lot of overlap even within the data sets. So for example, Apple might update 2 separate product lines to address one underlying vulnerability, and that would lead to a double count. And last, of course, having to batch everything by month to keep things manageably smooth makes it a little fuzzier on the back end. But these are the data sets we came away with, and we're going to run through Microsoft and Red Hat today, as those are where we had some interesting results. Apple and VMware had a null finding. There was no supply shock that we could see, and F5 didn't even have any Chinese tagged entities in its data set, though it was kind of an order of magnitude smaller than the other ones. So this here is a easy graph. Orange is China tag contributions, and blue are US tag contributions as a baseline. And this is representing on the y-axis their proportion of that month's contributions. And so over time, you can see what's a pretty typical story for all of our data sets is early on, the US kind of dominates the ecosystem. And then as other IT sectors develop, and as the kind of receiving entities become more open to international contribution, you see China, but other countries as well, contributing more and more. And obviously here, we can take a quick look at the quick cliff dive that seems to happen around one of our key dates, July 2020. So these are some basic trend lines, and we see increasing Chinese participation in this, the Microsoft ecosystem, but a pretty noticeable and steep decline there. So we looked not just at the proportions, but also the raw counts to get a bit more context. And what was interesting here with the Microsoft data was that it was really the continued productivity of the ecosystem, despite what you could consider to be the Chinese contributions returning to some kind of mean, that set off that proportional drop. So this is not a no to our question of is there a supply shock going on, but it doesn't seem to trickle out into the larger ecosystem, which is a little bit reassuring. And then for the Red Hat data, you'll have to forgive some very spiky graphs. Early on, there's almost only US participation because the timeline goes much farther back than the Microsoft data. But we see, again, a similar kind of increase in Chinese and other countries participating in that kind of reporting pipeline. And then, again, we have a drop-off. But here, if you can't see, it is between 2017 February to April, which is the date we have no explanation for. And then, again, that kind of continued drop-off resumes an upward trend, but stays pretty suppressed throughout. So here's looking just at the contribution counts, right, the raw numbers rather than the proportions. And this context is also helpful. It seems that that drop-off was sustained a little more thoroughly than the proportional data would lead you to believe. There was also just a following drop-off in overall contributions to the ecosystem. And what's notable here, too, is that given that this is an open source set of data points, there's a lot more credit given to individual researchers that we didn't tag to any country. So there's a greater gap between the total contributions and the by-country contributions. And then finally, for a bit of context, we thought we'd throw in the Apple data as well, given it was our largest data set and the one with the strongest lack of anything related to the RMSV possibly happening. So again, early on, we have that same story of a lot of US participation. And we suspect, too, that a big part of what leads other countries to contribute more down the line is just the market penetration of the actual products in those countries. And as you can see over time, China becomes a greater and greater participant, as well as the other countries, which are just not shown here for a bit of clarity. And here are the raw contribution counts. And you can also see what's interesting about the Apple data is seasonality. In every other month and then every 4 months, there's a spike in the number of CVEs addressed, which might reflect some kind of security patching scheduling going on there. But it's nonetheless a really interesting data point to find no affected product, particularly given that we've seen Apple products focused on at hacking competitions like the Tianfu Cup. But that's another consideration to give this data is because we're capturing pretty much anything counted as a vulnerability, we're potentially blurring those kind of high impact vulnerabilities that are more likely to be tailored towards offensive use. So our kind of key takeaways from this were, on the one hand, there doesn't seem to be what we expected to find, which is a clear drop-off in any or all of these ecosystems that affected total contributions. But we did find something pretty clear in the Microsoft data, just not so clear what actually caused it. So that July 2020 data I mentioned, on the one hand, it's kind of our strongest case for a drop-off because And we also have no idea what happened with the Red Hat data. Would really love to know if anyone has any insight. But it's definitely something worth looking into, because our other key takeaway is that the kind of reliability of this ecosystem can't be taken for granted. I think generally it's not thought of about as a supply, but we're finding that to be a pretty useful way to frame how to build resilience into it. You can almost buy security in that sense, or something close to it. And we finish up with a couple of recommendations for how governments and companies, without kind of mirroring China's type of law, can invest in that ecosystem and kind of maintain its resilience to any localized legal context shifts. So the first thing on those lines in that kind of preservation front would be to harmonize, not super rigorously, but at least in spirit, CVD processes between governments and private sector entities, so that there's not so much ambiguity for a researcher who finds something and doesn't know kind of what the rules of the road are for reporting in the ecosystem that they're working in. We also figure that, particularly with the open source ecosystem, investing in vulnerability discovery tools can take a lot of that workload off of researchers and can still be a way of investing directly into security, particularly given that there isn't so much of a officially set up bug bounty system for the open source ecosystem, although I think there are a few initiatives just starting up actually that are doing just that. And then the third point that we wanted to recommend was, by keeping track of where kind of the flow of disclosures and vulnerability research is directed, you can get a sense of, if things fall off, where it might be worth investing in more research. So for example, if an ecosystem starts to kind of dry up and there are not as many vulnerabilities found there, each vulnerability found in that product or code base is going to be more valuable from a security perspective. And ensuring that the kind of incentives built around that line up and funnel researchers there before they have to worry about how much they're going to get paid for something they turn over, which is not necessarily clear up front. You can kind of build in not just resilience to the supply, but to how that research community is able to interact with different companies and different code bases. So that's kind of the short story is, though, we're trying to consider vulnerability research writ large as a supply, right? A community that has to be kind of invested in and given some legal guardrails and protections. And wanted to ask, is it possible for bad policy to shock that system, to cut off a large proportion of it from the rest of the community? The answer, we don't really know, but maybe. It's definitely not no. And there are definitely a couple of concerning drops that we would want to look into further. And given that those drops didn't trickle into the broader ecosystem, it seems there is some innate resilience built in. And I can talk more about the kind of specifics behind that drop-off. There's some really cool data points about an increase in unattributed contributions in the same time frame. But finally, there are also proactive ways to invest in this, right? We don't have to kind of wait for someone to make a copycat law of the RMSV and then start worrying about a fractured ecosystem. And a lot of those initiatives don't only protect against those types of laws, but they build up a stronger research community. So we've got a draft report up. We're really hoping to kind of incorporate input from a lot of experts in technical fields, a lot of people on the ground. Hoping to talk to some researchers as well. So feel free to take a quick read. Get in touch with us if you have any kind of notes or questions. And I think we've got about 10 minutes left here where we can do some Q&A, which would be really helpful from our front. But thanks so much. Really appreciate y'all coming.